Good morning. While the traffic jam is subsiding, you can turn in your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 15. I like to see the folks lined up headed to class. That's a good thing. Young folks and older folks too. We left off in chapter 15 last week. I show we just got started on the chapter. Is that right? Well, that's about where I had. By the way, I want to mention something. Number one, Robert, you had asked about 14 verse 2. Why was the woman called a wise woman? Was there any significance in that? Um, I haven't seen anybody, as far as any commentaries or anything I looked at, give any significance to that. I think it's just kind of, he knew she had some wisdom, and so maybe she helped concoct this little parable of sorts to go to King David, and maybe it's just pointing out she was wise enough to help come up with this story that would get David's attention and get kind of drive home that point. That's the only thing I can figure, because nobody that I found has said anything as far as giving it any significance. There is possibility that folks have just missed it, that there is some significance to that. My best guess would be that probably just exactly what I said, is that just pointing out that she was wise enough to help come up with this. And it's a wise story, because she's a widow, bless her heart, she's been deprived of her son. Oh, I don't want to be deprived of my other son. It's a good, it's kind of like some of the television dramas that you see. They can sometimes jerk at, tear at your heartstrings, and sometimes they can really get involved, and you go, man, somebody had to be really clever to come up with that, even just that plot. So I suspect it's that's probably the significance of it. Another thing with the whole situation in chapter 14 with the wise woman coming, and she tells this account to King David, this story that she and Joab have contrived. And we asked the question in chapter 14. I was looking for it. Oh yeah, Absalom, knowing all this situation, why is Joab so intent, even to the point of going behind David's back and getting this lady to go to David? Why so intent on that? And we're not told exactly why, but Brother Jimmy mentioned something that I had kind of not really thought about this, but since he mentioned it, it's one of those things where when somebody brings it out, you kind of go, oh yeah. If you watch throughout these chapters and throughout Samuel, all the goings on with Joab, he's real concerned with appearance. Joab is always worried about appearance. In fact, you're going to see it after the rebellion of Absalom. He's worried because it looks bad that David's over here mourning over his son when they just won the victory. Hey man, this looks bad. You got to clean yourself up and get over here and start leading the people. Which in that instance he was right, but you see Joab worried about appearance a lot. And it seems that he's always wanting David or whomever to be very presidential, as we would say, kingly, they would say. And that probably seems to me to be the best explanation for what you see in chapter 14. Why does Joab go out and bring Absalom back? Why is he so intent on that? You would seem like he doesn't have a dog in that fight, as we say. But it seems like he's saying to David, hey man, this looks bad. You're putting a bad image out there. You got family issues. Make it right. Get your son back home so everybody sees a united front. He's all about appearances. And even if the appearances may not be true, he didn't really care what was really going on in David's house as far as, seemingly, but he wants it to look good to the people. Again, that's in the realm of speculation. The Bible doesn't tell us 100% for sure. But I think that makes sense, because you see that a lot with Joab throughout all the chapters that deal with him in this particular section of Scripture. So, interesting thought. I had not really given much thought about that, but now as I continue to study this and I've looked back over some of what we've already covered and going ahead, studying ahead for today and the next few classes, you just see this with Joab. He just seems like he's always worried about appearance. He wants David to appear very noble and kingly. And of course, David it's not that he's not a kingly type person, but David is not as worried about appearance. David is worried about leading as he ought to lead. He's very worried about following God. Not to say that he doesn't make mistakes, as we've already seen, but he's just not as worried about appearance as he is about action. Joab, on the other hand, very much political in that aspect. All right, now getting back to chapter 15. So Absalom has started this rebellion. He's come back home. He's standing in the gate and basically telling everybody, well, if I were king, I'd handle your situation very differently, and I would give you justice. And that's kind of the thing he's saying. Of course, he's going to tell David, I've made this vow. I said that when I was in Geshur in Syria, if the Lord would bring me back, then I was going to serve the Lord. And the king says to him, go in peace. So he arose and went to Hebron. So Absalom goes to Hebron. Did he really make this vow when he was in Geshur? Who knows? It would seem not. It seems like this is just a complete made-up thing that he's making up just to get away from David and to go put his coup in motion. But he sends spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then ye shall say, Absalom reigneth in Hebron. There are times in the Bible where the Bible will very succinctly state something. Sometimes just a few words, sometimes a verse or a couple of verses. And you read it, and it's one of the amazing things of Scripture. And it's one of those, it's not one of the huge major things that we would say this shows the Bible is from God, but it's one of those little things that evidences inspiration. It doesn't always answer our curiosity. Don't you know verse 10 is a drop in the bucket as to what really was going on here? Absalom doesn't just send messengers through the land and say, well, when you hear the trumpet, you'll say Absalom reigneth. If that's all there was to it, people would say, no, David's the king. But there's been ongoing treachery here. There's so much more wrapped up in this conspiracy than what we're told about. It's one of those that, as Brother Bland used to tell us, you live right and go to heaven and ask God when you get there. I want to find out more about this because there's obviously a lot more going on, much more to this than what's revealed to us here. But he set everything up so that when they hear the sound of the trumpet, those who are with him are going to say, Absalom reigneth in Hebron. So with him went about 200 men out of Jerusalem that were called. They went in their simplicity, and they knew not anything. So here are men in verse 11, 200 men that were likely some of the most influential, some of the most powerful men in all of Jerusalem. But they don't know what's going on. I don't know what he told them. Again, the Bible doesn't always satisfy our curiosity. I don't know what he told them to get them to go with him, but they don't have a clue that they're being used as pawns to try to prop up his conspiracy. Even though they were ignorant, don't you know the citizens in Hebron, when Absalom marches in with 200 of the most influential men in all of Jerusalem, what do they think? Yeah, they're with him. It's at least going to have that appearance, but the Bible tells us in no uncertain terms, they don't know what they're doing. And here's the thing. I mean, give Absalom his due. This is a pretty shrewd move on his part, because they come marching into Hebron. They have at least the appearance of being with him. What happens if they say, whoa, time out, we're not part of this rebellion? Well, they immediately become hostages at that point. So they're kind of in a no-win situation. Absalom shows he's a pretty clever fellow. And so he's got these 200 men with him, some of the most powerful, influential. And if they object, well, they're hostages. If they don't object, they have at least the appearance of looking like they're on Absalom's side. So it's kind of a tough situation for them, but a very smart move by Absalom as far as shrewd, not smart in the sense of being right. Absalom sends for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor from his city, even from Gilo, while he offered sacrifices, and the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. This is interesting. He sends for Ahithophel, who was David's counselor. In other words, who was one of the best who would know David's weaknesses, David's tendencies. And so he sends for this fellow. He's getting to David's inner circle here. Again, a smart move as far as shrewd and military tactics. But it's ironic because Ahithophel, he's too wise a man to join himself to some conspiracy unless he knows it's going to be successful. The irony is, of course, if Absalom had listened to Ahithophel's counsel, what happens? He'd have probably been king, right? The rebellion probably would have succeeded. Now, we're going to find out later on that God had planned otherwise. And a lot of this gets back to chapter 7, where God made a promise to David, right? Your seed's going to sit on the throne, and it wasn't, that the Messiah was coming from that seed, and really even going back further than that, to a promise God made to Abraham. There are messianic implications here, in other words. So God is going to destroy or put to naught the counsel of Ahithophel. But it is ironic that if Absalom had, he's got Ahithophel wrapped up in this conspiracy here clearly, and if he had just listened to him, he probably would have succeeded. Now, of course, he wouldn't have, because God was going to make sure that David was successful ultimately. But that's interesting to me. Why wasn't Ahithophel in Jerusalem with David? Well, again, it seems pretty clear. He's in on this. He's in on the conspiracy with Absalom. Brother Kaufman, in his commentary, suspects that, and again, this is one of those you can't know for sure, but he suspects, and I think there's probably something to it, that Ahithophel probably was one of the chief architects of this conspiracy. I mean, he's known as a wise man. He's known as a counselor, and he's known for, in fact, there's a text, we'll come to it in, maybe today, or if not today, next week, where it says it was known in those days that you ask counsel from Ahithophel, it's like asking counsel from God. His advice was just that good. He was that wise. So, would seem pretty safe to assume that he's probably been in on this from the get-go. He's probably one of the chief architects of this rebellion. It's also interesting that unless sometimes you have folks by the same name, and you'll see this with Mephibosheth, and we'll get there, and I'll talk more about that when we get to that chapter later on. But unless there's a fellow by the same name, and there's nowhere else in Scripture to indicate that there is another one, but, again, just making sure we cover all the bases, because it is possible that there's someone else by the same name. But unless so, then Ahithophel would have been the grandfather of Bathsheba. Isn't that interesting? Eliam, of course, was her father. Ahithophel is mentioned, if you want to look at 2 Samuel 23. Oh, did I get a wrong reference? Oh, sorry. I was thinking 24. It's 34. This is mentioning some different people here in this context, and it says Eliphalet, the son of Ahasbai, the son of the Maachathite, Eliam, son of Ahithophel, the Gilonite. Now again, Ahithophel the Gilonite here that's pretty specific. Where does Absalom send for him from? From his town, which says, it refers to him as the Gilonite. So again, Eliam could possibly be somebody different, but it seems pretty clear. I'd have to do a lot deeper research to be 100% for sure, but it seems like this is the same fella. There's, of course, in 2 Samuel 11, verse 3, mentions that she's the daughter of Eliam. So again, unless somebody is a different name, same name, different person, then this is the grandfather of Bathsheba. And he had to know, interestingly also, if he is Bathsheba's grandfather. Bathsheba, after the child died, that was part of the consequence of David's sin, but they had another child. And that child was named Solomon, which would be Ahithophel's, it'd be his great-grandson. He's in on this conspiracy. What do you reckon is going to happen to Solomon if Absalom succeeds in his conspiracy? What do you know is going to happen to Solomon? He's gone. So that's interesting to me that Ahithophel is wrapped up in this. And again, the Bible does not say 100% for sure. I think the implication is pretty clear. If there's any text where you could even halfway argue that maybe he wasn't, that would be it. But he is going to later on give counsel to Absalom and say, go and attack and catch David while he's weak and off guard. That's obviously not what they're going to do, but that's very interesting to me that, here's a man who's plotting against, number one, he's plotting against his friend, but he has to know that if his plot plays out, successfully, he's going to lose his great-grandson. Yes, sir. Yeah, that's and I'm glad you mentioned that, Jimmy. But Jimmy was pointing out this goes back to what Nathan told David from God. Part of the punishment, the consequences for David's sin, is the sword will never depart from your house, and even within your own family, there's going to be turmoil, and bear that in mind as you go through all these chapters, because you just see it over and over again. It just keeps happening, and that's what's going on, is that it's a consequence of that sin. But very interesting that Ahithophel's caught up in this when it means if it succeeds, it means he's going to lose his great-grandson. Verse 13 says, there came a messenger to David saying, the hearts of the men of Israel are after Absalom. How did this happen with David, who is so popular? Sometimes, have you ever read this and thought, David was David. People love David. How does a conspiracy against David, of all people, ever succeed? Adam Clark, in his commentary, he gives 7 reasons. I'll give you these very quickly. I think any one of these or combination of these might help us to explain and understand how this happened. David is, at this point, he's getting older, right? He's not just a spring chicken anymore, as we say. He may be afflicted in some way, but he probably couldn't well attend to the administration of justice in the land, is what Clark says. I would submit to you maybe he was caught up a lot with his family drama. Maybe that's why he's not attending to justice in the land. Number 2, David in some measure is not attending to the affairs of state. We know that because in 2 Samuel 15, verse 3, what is Absalom telling people at the gate? He says, if I were the judge, here's what I would do. There aren't judges attending to matters. So some of the affairs of state are getting neglected, at least some. Joab's power was overgrown, number 3. Joab was wicked, insolent, oppressive to the people, and David is often... Adam Clark says David was often afraid to execute the laws against him. I don't know if it was fear or some other reason, but David, he did not execute the laws against him. In fact, he places that squarely in the lap of his son on his deathbed. I don't know why, but he never would execute the laws, the judgment against Joab. And so Joab's power gets overgrown. Joab stays with David, but you can see where that has a bad appearance in the kingdom and looks bad on David. There were still perhaps some partisans, this is number 4, perhaps there were still some partisans of the household of Saul who they didn't think the crown was fairly obtained by David or something like that. Maybe they still have affections for the household of Saul. So that could have helped, and maybe they start, spreading these and you see what's going on, and that could hurt David. Number 5, consequences of his adultery with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah. This is going back to 2 Samuel 12. Clark just throws this in with the 7. I submit to you this is the overarching reason for all of this. But number 5 is the biggie. Number 6, there are always those who are difficult and disillusioned in any state, any government, people who are always hoping to gain something from a change. In fact, we had a president a few years ago that was elected simply on the word change. I mean, that was basically the whole campaign. Change. Are you ready for change? Don't you want change? And sometimes you say the word change and it just gets people, yeah, okay, let's have a change. So that may have been what happened in David's kingdom. Maybe that was Absalom's campaign slogan, change. Absalom, number 7, appeared to be the real and undisputed heir to the throne at this time. He appears, at the very least, to be the heir. David, of course, by the very course of nature, David's not going to live forever, right? And so some people are, as I like the way Adam Clark puts this, he says some people are more inclined toward the rising versus the setting sun. And that's true too, right? Sometimes people say, well, so-and-so here, he's old. Don't you time to get some youth and energy and some vigor in here? That may have been what Absalom had going for him as well. But anyway, some of those may have been the reasons. Don't forget, as I said, number 5 is the biggie. This is a consequence of David's sin with Bathsheba and his subsequent murder of Uriah. Verse 14, David says to all his servants that were with him at Jerusalem, arise, let us flee, for we shall not else escape from Absalom. Make speed to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring evil upon us and smite the city with the edge of the sword. Time out. Hold the phone. David, who grabs a lion by the beard and kills him barehanded or with a club. He fights with a bear and kills a bear. He says, let me at this giant. And now he's fleeing in fear. What gives? What do you make of that? That's what I'm getting at. Billy said, is it fear or is it the fact that he doesn't want to fight and let alone kill his own son? That's the big thing here. David doesn't want to fight his son. I think he's also concerned about the inhabitants of the city of Jerusalem. What is it, the term that's so often used now? Collateral damage. Women, children, innocents being killed along with the fighting. He knows Absalom doesn't really have scruples. Absalom's not going to come and say, oh, don't hurt this person. If you even hint toward you might be siding with David, he'd kill him. So David is looking out for everybody. The overarching thing being, of course, he doesn't want to fight his son. So he abandons the city. Somebody also pointed out that, even if the inhabitants had been pretty strong with David, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, what if Absalom surrounds the city, hems David in? Again, innocents might get hurt. So, and it's also interesting here, nobody with David says, whoa, David, you don't need to run. You're running scared here. Nobody questions him. And so it shows that it was a smart military move. This is not cowardice on David's part. And don't forget, David is a military man. He knows exactly what he's doing. In fact, is he going to end up winning or losing? Of course, we know the end of the story. He's going to end up winning. Part of it is because of what he does. He ends up battling. When the fight finally comes, they're in the woods. It's not out in the open where it's just going to be sheer numbers that win the day. And the text is going to tell us when we get there that the woods get as many people or more than the actual fighting men. So David's not afraid. He's just he's making a smart military move, and of course he doesn't want to fight with his son. But it's interesting that sometimes, and you're going to see this with David, there's a lesson to be careful with our own family, right? Because it's not pleasant when you've got your own family member that has to be opposed because they're not doing right. Never is pleasant. But, sometimes you have to take a stand because they're wrong. That may be in any situation, but it also is true in congregations. I've seen entire congregations sometimes take a drastic turn because a father would not stand up to his daughter or his son that was caught up in open sin. And I've seen that happen even with elders that just suddenly change their position on something that is biblical. They had held a biblical position for years, and all of a sudden they change their position. And when you start peeling back the layers, you see that there's something going on in their own family. And, there's Things always need to be handled with tact and with kindness and with the love of the Lord. But there's a time we got to stand against even our family if they're wrong. So David has to learn that, and he struggles with that clearly with Absalom. So he makes preparation to flee. The servants say in verse 15, "Thy servants are ready to do whatsoever my lord the king shall appoint." The king goes forth, all his household. He left 10 women which were concubines to keep the house. Of course, bear that in mind for later on. The king went forth, and all the people after him, and tarried in a place that was far off. So he's making his way out of the city, taking certain people with him. His servants pass on beside him, the Kerethites, Pelethites, Gittites, 600 men which came after him from Gath passed on before the king. Then the king says to Ittai the Gittite, "Wherefore goest thou also with us? Return to thy place and abide with the king, for thou art a stranger and also an exile." And Gittai is going to say to him, essentially he's going to say, "No way. Whereas thou camest but yesterday, should I this day make thee go up and down with us, seeing I go whither I may? Return thou and take back thy brethren, mercy and truth be with thee." Here's where he says it. I'm sorry, I was one verse early. Ittai answered the king and said, "As the Lord liveth, and as my lord the king liveth, surely in what place my lord the king shall be, whether in death or life, even there also will thy servant be." You see Ittai's loyalty. So David says, "So be it. Go and pass over." So he did. And all the country wept with a loud voice, verse 23, and all the people passed over. The king also himself passed over the brook Kidron, and all the people passed over toward the way of the wilderness. So they're leaving the city, of course. This brook is kind of not really a significant body of water. In fact, it was dry, I'm told, much of the year. But it's kind of marking their passing out of Jerusalem. But verse 24 says, "Zadok also and the Levites were with him, bearing the ark of the covenant of God. And they set down the ark of God, and Abiathar went up until all the people had done passing out of the city. The king, though, goes and says to Zadok, 'Carry back the ark of God into the city. If I shall find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me again and show me both it and his habitation. But if he thus say, I have no delight in thee, behold, here am I. Let him do to me as seemeth good unto him.'" This is interesting because this is very different from another instance I have in mind. Does anybody know what I'm thinking of? Maybe you're thinking of the same thing. It's in Samuel, but it's way back in 1 Samuel, early in 1 Samuel. There was an attack, and the Israelites were defeated by Philistines. And so after their defeat, they got the bright idea, hey, I know what we need to do. And so they decide what? Get the Ark of the Covenant. Bring the Ark. Bring the lucky charm. And so they brought the Ark out, and what happened? They were defeated again, and then to add insult to injury, the Ark got taken. And God was trying to make a point to them. Sometimes, even today, we get caught up with lucky charms, right? Talisman, things like that. David understands the ark is not some kind of talisman that's going to protect him in and of itself. It represented God's presence among his people. This happens even years down the road after David, when the nation of Judah is so corrupt in the time of Jeremiah. And Jeremiah says they would constantly say, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. And he says, God's not with you. You're not with God. You're not following God. And so he's not going to protect you just because there's some temple, physical edifice sitting in Jerusalem. So David understands that. It's not a lucky charm. He says, take the ark back. It belongs there. And if God delights in me, then he'll bring me back, ark or no ark. But if God doesn't want me back, if God is determined that this is how it's going to end with my death and my defeat, then that's God's will. If that's God's will, who am I to speak against it? Nothing I can do to change that. So interesting attitude that David has, a much more scriptural attitude than you see from those Israelites in 1 Samuel chapter 4. So he sends Zadok back, verse 27. Are you not a seer, which is another word for what? Prophet. So he says, return to the city in peace, and your two sons with you, Ahimaaz and Jonathan. And he says, I'm going to tarry in the plain of the wilderness until there come word from you to certify me. So he says, hey, look, I need some eyes and ears back there in Jerusalem. And so he says, I'm going to tarry in the plain. You send word when you've got it. So Zadok, therefore, and Abiathar carried the ark of God again to Jerusalem, and they tarried there. So they carry the ark back, and they wait there in Jerusalem. They just stay there. And so they're going to, of course, later on send word to David. David went up by the ascent of Mount Olivet, wept as he went up, had his head covered. This is a sign of grieving, of course. He's barefoot. All the people that were with him covered every man his head, and they went up weeping as they went up. And so somebody tells them David's going to receive some bad news because they say Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, O Lord, I pray thee, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. And interestingly, God is going to do just that, of course. It came to pass when David was come to the top of the mount where he worshiped God, behold, Hushai, the Archite, came to meet him with his coat rent and earth upon his head, unto whom David said, If thou passest on with me, then thou shalt be a burden unto me. And he's not saying, you're just too much of a burden for me. He's in a very nice way saying, it's one more man for us to have to feed and take care of and all this. But basically David is saying, I've got a better idea. He says, If thou return to the city and say unto Absalom, I will be thy servant, O king, as I have been thy father's servant hitherto, so will I now also be thy servant. Then mayest thou for me defeat the counsel of Ahithophel. So he says, look, go back and tell Absalom you're going to be a servant. And maybe you can help me by defeating the counsel of Ahithophel. He knew Ahithophel was going to give really good advice. And he says, maybe you could go and help counteract that. And so he's not trying to say, look, you're just such a burden. He's just saying, hey, there's a much better way you could serve the kingdom and your king, David, by going back. And he says, look, you've got Zadok and Abiathar, the priests there. When you hear something, tell Zadok and Abiathar. They've got their sons. They can send their sons. So Hushai goes back to the city, verse 37, and Absalom came into Jerusalem. Why is it so important for him to get back hastily? Yeah, you need to be there when Absalom enters the city, is what he's basically saying, because it's not gonna hold much water if you come back from following David. You're gonna have to, it's gonna be a much harder sell, as we say. So he says you need to be there when Absalom arrives in the city for this thing to stick. So, chapter 16, David is a little past the top of the hill. Now, old Ziba comes out to meet him. Who is Ziba? We talked about him a little while back in chapter 9? Is that right? Just went blank. Yeah, he's the servant of Mephibosheth. And so Ziba comes out to meet David. Yeah, chapter 9. Remember David showed kindness to Mephibosheth. So he comes out to meet him, and he's, the king says to Ziba in verse 2, what do you mean by these? What's going on here? And so Ziba tells him, look, I'm bringing all this out for you, king. I'm giving you animals, beasts of burden, food, anything you can use, take it. And the king says, the natural question, hey, where's thy master's son? Of course, Jonathan was Ziba's master. Jonathan died, so you've got now Ziba. Mephibosheth. So he's basically saying, where's Mephibosheth? Where is he? And Ziba says, well, he's there at Jerusalem. And he said, today shall the house of Israel restore me the kingdom of my father. And of course, David, he's getting one side of the story. He doesn't know any better. Poor old Mephibosheth is left. He's lame. He can't just saddle up a horse or donkey or whatever and take off and go and say, hey, this isn't true. But the king says to Ziba, behold, thine are all that pertain unto Mephibosheth. And Ziba said, I humbly beseech thee that I may find grace in thy sight, my lord, O king. And we don't really know why Ziba's doing this, but I've tried to even come up with speculation. There's no reason. Maybe he just wants the inheritance. David had told him back in chapter 9, you oversee the inheritance of Mephibosheth. Maybe he liked it and wanted the inheritance and figures if I can make Mephibosheth out to be a traitor, then, I don't know. I don't understand exactly why he's doing this. Maybe he's just a treacherous individual, but be that as it may, now comes along Shimei. What a character he is. David came to Bahurim, and then comes out a man of the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera. He comes forth, he's cursing as he comes, he's throwing stones at David and at all the servants of King David. All the people, the mighty men, were on his right hand and on his left. And so Shimei is cursing. He says, come out, thou bloody man, and thou man of Belial. Man of Belial is a way of saying, kind of an evil, wicked person. He says, you're a bloody man as well. Well, the bloody man was right, because David had a lot of bloodshed. In fact, that's one of the reasons why God said you're not going to build the temple. But wow, some strong words from this fella. He says, the Lord hath returned on thee all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose stead thou hast reigned. And the Lord hath delivered the kingdom into the hand of Absalom thy son. And behold, thou art taken in thy mischief, because thou art a bloody man. What did David ever do to Saul? All he ever did was show him kindness. He had at least 2 opportunities to kill him outright. Easy. And he chose not to do so, because he said, I won't lift my hand against the Lord's anointed. But that's kind of the point of slander. It's not true. So Abishai, the son of Zeruiah. Who else was the son of Zeruiah? So if we're remembering our family trees here. Does anybody remember that? Nobody? I thought somebody remembered that. He's an unscrupulous fella. Always worried about appearances. Joab, there you go. Joab was another. So this was Joab's brother. They had another brother who's dead at this point. You remember his name? Asahel. That's the one that Abner killed him because he wouldn't stop pursuing him, and he turned around and fought. He literally turned around the spear and stabbed him. And then Joab killed Abner. Joab just a piece of work. But anyway, Abishai would be Joab's brother. He says to the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over, I pray thee, and take off his head. He says, I got a solution for this. I'll shut this fellow up. The king says, what have I to do with you, ye sons of Zeruiah? Let him curse, because the Lord has said unto him, curse David. Who shall then say, wherefore hast thou done so? And then he says, behold, my son which came forth of my bowels seeketh my life. How much more may this Benjamite do it? Let him alone, let him curse, for the Lord hath bidden him. It may be that the Lord will look on mine affliction, and that the Lord will requite me good for his cursing this day. So the Lord said to Shimei to curse David? What do you think of that? I don't think there's any indication that that's really the case. I think this is David saying, hey, you know what? David, I suspect at this point, David is remembering, and the words are ringing pretty loudly in his ear. The sword will never depart from your house, David. You've committed this sin. You're not going to die, but there are some serious consequences. And David is essentially saying to him, look, you know what? In a way, I really deserve this. I'm getting exactly what I deserve. I killed Uriah. I took his wife. I committed adultery. This is from God. And maybe that's kind of how he feels, as if God had said to him, curse David. And he says, maybe God will look at this and me, kind of like with Saul. Saul kept persecuting him, and I didn't retaliate. Maybe God will look at this and he'll requite me good for his cursing. But I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever that God actually sent Shimei to curse David. Verse 13, as David and his men went by the way, Shimei is going down the hillside. He's cursing, throwing stones, of course, and they came weary. They refreshed themselves there. Absalom comes to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel with him. So Hushai the Archite, he comes to Absalom. Hushai says to Absalom, God save the king, God save the king. And Absalom basically says to Hushai, this is how you treat your friend David? Why did you not go with him? Seems he's kind of testing him here. Is this how you treat your friend? Why are you not with your friend David? And Hushai says, this is kind of interesting, because maybe Hushai is saying to himself, well, I'm not lying. He's definitely bending the truth here and being dishonest. But he says, well, whom the Lord and his people and this people and all the men of Israel choose, his will I be, and with him will I abide. Well, that's a pretty generic statement, isn't it? Basically, hey, whoever ends up on the winning side of this, I'm with him. And of course, Hushai, he's with David, and we know that because of his advice. But it's interesting how he tries to, maybe he's soothing his conscience by saying, well, I'm not lying. And again, whom should I serve? Should I not serve in the presence of his son? As I have served in thy father's presence, so will I be in thy presence. And so Absalom says to Ahithophel, give counsel among you what we shall do. And Ahithophel tells him, go to your father's concubines, which he's left to keep the house. All Israel shall hear thou art abhorred of thy father. Then shall the hands of all that are with thee be strong. That'll show you're really sideways of your dad now, because you've gone into the concubines. So he says, you want to really establish that there is no going back from this conspiracy? That's how to do it. And so that's what they did. They spread a tent upon the top of the house. Absalom went in under the concubines in the sight of all Israel. How perverted is this man at this point? The counsel of Ahithophel, which he counseled in those days, was as if a man had inquired at the oracle of God. So was all the counsel of Ahithophel, both with David and with Absalom. Remember that, because in the very next chapter, Absalom is not going to listen to the counsel of Ahithophel. He's going to listen to the counsel of Hushai. That's God's doings, but it's really going to turn the tide of this rebellion and cost Absalom his attempt at the throne and also his life. Thank you very much. We'll have to have a break before worship, and Lord willing, next Sunday we will pick up with chapter 17, verse 1. Thank you.